I found out I was fired at 6:42 a.m. Not from a phone call, not from a meeting, from an automated email that thanked me for my contributions and told me my access had already been revoked. By the time I finished reading it, my work laptop had logged me out. I just sat there staring at the screen, waiting to feel angry. But I didn't, because something about the timing felt rehearsed. The night before, everything had been normal. My manager had even told me we'd talk next week about a promotion track. I believed him. I always did. What they didn't know was that I had stayed late that night, not to work harder, not to prove loyalty. I stayed because I'd noticed patterns, numbers that didn't line up, files that disappeared after meetings, decisions that always blamed the same people, me included. So when the email came, I didn't panic. I made coffee, and I opened a folder I'd quietly built over months. At the time, I still thought this was just a company protecting itself. I had no idea I was already holding proof of something much bigger, and that firing me overnight was the first mistake they'd made. Before all of this, my life was painfully ordinary. I'm Darth. I worked as a senior operations analyst at a mid-sized tech firm, big enough to feel important, small enough to feel personal. I wasn't flashy. I didn't network aggressively or play office politics. I showed up on time, did my work, and went home. For years, that had been enough. My role was simple on paper: review performance data, audit internal reports, and flag inconsistencies. Most days were spreadsheets, dashboards, and quiet meetings where everyone nodded and agreed. I liked the predictability. Numbers made sense. People didn't always. My manager Colin liked to call me steady. Not brilliant, not ambitious, just steady. That suited me fine. I wasn't trying to climb fast. I'd seen what happened to people who did. They burned out or disappeared. I preferred being invisible, the guy leadership trusted with sensitive data but never worried about. At least that's what I thought. Looking back, the signs were there. They were small, easy to ignore. A report I submitted would come back altered, with no explanation. A metric I flagged would be reframed in the next meeting. When I asked questions, I was told not to overthink it. High-level decisions, Colin would say. Context you don't need. I believed him. I wanted to. The company had been missing targets for 3 quarters straight, but somehow leadership bonuses kept growing. Every all-hands meeting followed the same script: optimistic slides, vague accountability, and a reminder that layoffs were always possible if performance didn't improve. Somehow, performance never improved, and somehow the blame always landed in the same departments, mine included. Still, my reviews were solid. No warnings, no write-ups. In fact, 2 weeks before I was fired, Colin hinted that I was being considered for a more strategic role. He said it casually, like it wasn't a big deal. That night, I remember telling myself I'd finally been wrong about the unease I felt. I thought the discomfort was just stress, long hours, end of quarter pressure. But there was one moment I couldn't shake. During a routine audit, I noticed a dataset that had been locked, restricted access, even from my level. That was new. I shouldn't have been curious, but I was. When I asked about it, it told me the permissions came directly from executive leadership. No explanation, no paper trail. That's when I started keeping notes. Nothing dramatic, just dates, version numbers, screenshots of reports before and after meetings. I told myself it was for my own clarity, that I was being paranoid. At that point, I still believed I was safe. I still believed doing my job well would protect me. I didn't realize yet that being steady didn't make me valuable. It made me convenient. Once I started paying attention, it was hard to stop. The changes weren't obvious at first, they never are. A number shifted here. A chart reordered there. Nothing big enough to challenge directly, but enough to make my stomach tighten when I compared versions side by side. What bothered me most wasn't that the data was being adjusted, it was how carefully it was done. The edits always improved leadership optics while quietly worsening departmental performance. And every time a quarterly review came around, the narrative was already set before the meeting even started. I stopped raising flags in public. Instead, I listened. Meetings became exercises in translation. Executives spoke in broad language: alignment, efficiency, future positioning, while managers nodded and took notes. Afterward, those notes somehow turned into directives that pushed blame downward. By the time anything reached my team, the conclusion had already been decided. We were underperforming. We were the risk. We were the reason costs needed to be optimized. Colin's behavior changed too. Not drastically, just enough. He stopped asking for my input during meetings and started summarizing my reports himself. When I sent analysis directly to stakeholders, he'd reply within minutes, asking me to route everything through him first. Optics, he said. Consistency. I complied. At the same time, it began tightening access. Folders I'd used for years suddenly required approval. Historical data vanished from shared drives. When I asked, I was told it was part of a new compliance initiative. No announcement, no documentation, just silence. At home, I found myself replaying conversations in my head. The way Colin avoided eye contact when talking about future planning. The way leadership praised transparency while making decisions behind closed doors. I told myself I was overthinking it, but I still saved copies. Not entire databases. That would have been reckless. Just snapshots, before and after versions. Email threads where language shifted subtly, but meaning changed completely. Enough to establish patterns. I didn't know what I'd do with them. I didn't even label the folder clearly. It sat buried in my personal cloud storage under a name so boring, I almost forgot about it myself. Almost. The pressure peaked the week before everything ended. My team was pulled into a sudden review. No agenda, no prep time. Leadership questioned our methodology, our assumptions, our competence. They used examples I knew had been altered after leaving my hands. When I tried to clarify, Colin cut in smoothly, reframing my words before they landed. I let him. Not because I agreed, but because something had become clear. This wasn't about fixing numbers, it was about controlling the story. And stories need villains. That Friday, Colin stopped by my desk on his way out. He smiled, casual as ever, and told me to take the weekend off. Said I looked tired. Said we'd talk Monday. I nodded and wished him a good weekend. That night, instead of logging off, I stayed late. Not out of fear, out of instinct. Because pressure like that doesn't build unless something is about to break. Monday never came. I woke up early out of habit, checked my phone, and saw the email waiting for me. It had been sent while it was still dark outside, stamped with a time that felt deliberate, early enough to control the narrative, late enough that no one would push back. The subject line was neutral, almost polite. Inside, it was final. My position had been eliminated effective immediately. Access revoked, benefits ending at the close of the month, HR contact information listed at the bottom like an afterthought. No mention of performance, no warning, no meeting. I tried to log into my laptop anyway. It spun for a moment before locking me out completely. My work phone had already been wiped. Years of routine erased in seconds. Still, no anger. Just a strange calm. I forwarded the email to my personal account, more out of habit than hope, and made coffee like it was any other morning. The quiet felt louder than usual. I kept expecting another message, an explanation, a correction, but nothing came. Around 9, texts from coworkers started trickling in. Hey, are you okay? Did you know this was coming? They told us it was restructuring. Restructuring. The word was already doing its work. By the afternoon, I heard from someone in finance I trusted. He didn't say much, just that leadership had presented my termination as part of a broader efficiency move. My name had been attached to a slide about data inconsistencies and reporting risk. My work had become evidence against me. That's when I opened the folder. I hadn't planned to. I wasn't thinking about revenge or exposure. I just wanted to understand how clean the story really was. I scrolled through files I'd saved months earlier. Timestamps, version histories, internal emails that told a very different story than the one being circulated now. Patterns became timelines. Timelines became intent. Some of the reports used to justify my firing had been altered after my access was removed. Others referenced data I'd never produced, attributed to my name anyway. It was subtle enough that no one outside my role would question it. Clean, efficient, believable. I realized then that my firing wasn't a reaction. It was a step, a necessary one. That evening, HR finally called. The woman on the line sounded rehearsed, careful to avoid specifics. When I asked who made the decision, she said it was cross-functional. When I asked for documentation, she promised to email me what she could. She never did. After the call, I closed my laptop and sat there for a long time. Not shocked, not hurt, just certain. They hadn't fired me because I was a problem. They'd fired me because I was about to become one. The days after my firing blurred together in a way I hadn't expected. Not because I was busy, but because I wasn't. No meetings, no dashboards, no constant low-level urgency humming in the background, just long stretches of silence, broken occasionally by emails from HR that said very little and promised even less. I watched the company from the outside for the first time. LinkedIn posts went up praising strategic realignment. Executives shared articles about leadership and resilience. A few coworkers quietly removed my name from past projects, like erasing a footnote that no longer mattered. Others reached out in private, careful messages, vague questions, people who wanted reassurance that they were safe. I gave them none. Not because I was angry, but because I didn't trust the ground any of us were standing on anymore. Without access to internal systems, I relied on what I already had. I revisited old files slowly, deliberately, cross-checking them against public statements the company was making now, earnings calls, press releases, investor updates. The discrepancies weren't dramatic. They didn't need to be. The truth was buried in margins and definitions, how loss was framed, how growth was deferred, how responsibility was reassigned. And always, always, there was a missing link. Me. In nearly every case where data had been questioned internally, my role had been referenced. Sometimes directly, sometimes implied. My termination gave those references weight. It created a clean line between leadership decisions and the consequences. I was the risk they'd removed. What surprised me most was how calm they were about it. No legal threats, no non-disparagement reminders, just a quiet assumption that I would move on. They didn't see me as dangerous. They saw me as predictable. That's when I realized how they'd misjudged me. I wasn't ambitious, but I was methodical. I didn't react emotionally, but I noticed patterns. And while I hadn't known exactly why I was saving those files, I knew how to read them now. This wasn't incompetence. It was coordination. Departments weren't failing. They were being positioned. Reports weren't wrong. They were rewritten. And the same few names kept appearing at the edges of decisions, never directly accountable, always just outside the frame. One night, while organizing everything into a clearer timeline, I noticed something that made me stop. A version history timestamp. One I recognized. A report had been modified using my credentials after I was locked out. It wasn't possible, unless someone wanted it to look that way. I leaned back in my chair, feeling something shift. Not anger, not fear, but clarity. This wasn't just about being fired. It was about setting a precedent. And I was beginning to understand exactly how far they were willing to go to protect themselves. Up until that moment, I'd believed I was collateral damage, someone expendable, someone convenient. Fired to make a narrative cleaner, to redirect blame, to buy leadership a little time. That belief didn't survive the timestamp. I went back through the files carefully, slower this time. I checked system logs I'd exported months earlier, logs I'd barely paid attention to at the time because they hadn't seemed important. Now they were. My credentials hadn't just been used after my access was revoked. They'd been used selectively, only on reports tied to regulatory exposure, only on documents that executives had cited in closed-door meetings, and always in ways that made it look like I had approved changes I never even saw. This wasn't sloppiness, it was framing. They weren't just removing me, they were rewriting me, turning my role into a liability they could point to later if anyone asked the wrong questions. And then I noticed something else. The edits weren't made by IT. They were made by someone with executive-level access, using a mirrored credential system I'd helped design years earlier. A system meant for emergency continuity, something only a handful of people even knew existed, including Colin. The realization landed quietly but heavily. My manager hadn't just let this happen. He'd built the path for it. All those subtle changes. The insistence on routing reports through him, the way he'd summarized my work instead of letting me speak, the promotion talk, the timing of my firing. It wasn't about silencing me. It was about positioning me. I was never meant to stay. I was meant to take the fall. For the first time since this started, I felt something close to anger, not explosive, not reckless, but sharp and focused. The kind that strips emotion out of decisions and leaves only intent behind. They assumed I'd never see this, that I wouldn't understand the system well enough to trace it back, that once I was gone, the story would settle. What they didn't account for was that I'd helped build the very controls they were abusing, and I still had copies. This wasn't just evidence anymore, it was leverage. I didn't confront anyone. That was the hardest part, not reacting, not firing off emails, not demanding explanations. Every instinct told me to expose what I'd found immediately. But instincts are loud, plans need silence. So I stayed quiet. I stopped responding to coworkers' messages. I let HR's follow-up sit unanswered. From the outside, I probably looked like every other employee who'd been pushed out and was licking his wounds. In reality, I was organizing. I rebuilt the system timeline from scratch. Every file I'd saved went into a clean structure. Original versions, modified versions, access logs, timestamps. I matched them against public statements and internal meeting dates. The story that emerged wasn't dramatic, but it was airtight. Colin's name appeared again and again, never in direct edits, always in approval chains. Executive leadership stayed technically clean, insulated by layers of process. It was elegant in a way that made my skin crawl. This wasn't a crime of passion, it was design. I also did something else, something they never would have expected. I read my own employment contract, slowly, every clause, every footnote. I'd skimmed it when I was hired, like everyone does. Now I treated it like evidence. There it was, a provision about data retention and personal backups, written broadly enough to protect employees working on compliance audits. I'd insisted on that wording years ago after a minor incident the company wanted to forget. At the time, it had felt like overkill. Now it was a shield. I spoke to a lawyer carefully, not with accusations, just hypotheticals. What if an employee had evidence of internal misrepresentation? What if their credentials were used after termination? What if they were being positioned as a scapegoat? The answers were measured, but the pauses said more than the words. I wasn't exposed. They were. Still, I didn't move. Because leverage only works if the other side doesn't know you have it. So I waited. And sure enough, 2 weeks later, the company made its next move. A regulatory inquiry. Minor, they said. Routine. But suddenly, my name appeared in internal correspondence again. This time as a former employee tied to process failures. They were laying the groundwork, which meant the timing was almost perfect. The inquiry went public on a Thursday, not loudly, just a brief mention in an industry newsletter. Questions about reporting practices, internal controls, nothing that would alarm investors yet. The company responded within hours, confident and composed, emphasizing cooperation and transparency. They also named a point of reference. Me, a former analyst whose methodologies were under review at the time of separation. That was when I understood the full shape of it. They weren't preparing to defend themselves. They were preparing to hand someone over. Everything I'd seen, the rewritten reports, the credential misuse, the careful distance executives kept, wasn't just about hiding mistakes. It was about creating a believable failure point. A single, quiet professional who couldn't speak from inside the company anymore. And then, I saw what they hadn't. Buried in the inquiry documentation was a request I recognized immediately. A request for system-level access logs tied to report revisions over the past year. The regulator wasn't just asking what had been changed, they were asking who changed it. That's when the second twist locked into place. The mirrored credential system, the one they'd used to frame me, left a signature. Not visible to internal users, but embedded deep enough that it could be traced by an external audit. I designed it that way deliberately, years ago, after watching another company collapse under a similar investigation. I'd never told anyone, not even Colin. To them, it was the perfect tool. To me, it was a watermark. I reached out, not to the company, but to the regulator. Not emotionally, not defensively. I responded as a cooperative former employee, concerned about accuracy. I offered to provide personal backups that could clarify timelines. They accepted within hours. When the logs were compared, the story collapsed quietly. The edits attributed to me didn't originate from my workstation. The access tokens pointed somewhere else, somewhere much closer to executive leadership than anyone expected. Colin resigned the following Monday. The company called it unrelated, but the inquiry didn't stop. And for the first time since I'd been fired, I realized something important. I was never their biggest risk. I was the proof they'd underestimated. The company never announced the real reason Colin left. They didn't need to. Inside the industry, people understood what a resignation in the middle of an active inquiry meant. Titles changed, press releases softened language, responsibility became shared, then slowly faded into silence. My name disappeared from their narrative almost overnight. HR sent one final email. Polite, careful. It confirmed my separation terms and asked if I had any company property left to return. There was no apology. There didn't need to be one. The tone alone told me everything I needed to know. The inquiry wrapped up months later. No dramatic headlines, no criminal charges, just fines, compliance mandates, and a restructuring that reached much higher than my former department. A few executives retired early. Others moved on quietly to roles that didn't come with public scrutiny. As for me, I wasn't contacted again. I didn't sue. I didn't post anything online. I didn't tell my story publicly. Not because I was afraid, but because I didn't need to. The truth had already done its work. I found a new role eventually. Smaller company, fewer layers, more transparency. During the interview, they asked why I'd left my previous job so suddenly. I said it wasn't a good fit. That was true enough. Sometimes I think about that morning. The email, the locked laptop, the calm that surprised me. At the time, it felt like the end of something I'd built carefully over years. Now I see it differently. They fired me overnight because they thought they were erasing a problem. What they really did was remove themselves from the only person who still had the full picture. And by the time they realized that, it was already too late. The lesson here isn't revenge. It's understanding where real value lives.